What'd you say? All right. I'm going to introduce myself. Thank you, Tzvi. My name is Akiva Perlman. Thank you. I believe that was my brother Sani. It's a real honor to be here. I'm Rosh Yeshiva and everyone in this room, because everyone's taken a great deal of time to be here. Right before I got up to speak, I asked Tzvi what the number was. Where were we at today? And I think for those who follow Amudim, and they have an email that goes out to people every time we have an unfortunate loss in our community, he lets us know, because he cares about the entire nation, he lets us know where we're holding. He shared a number that I don't want to share tonight, not because I'm afraid to say it. It's a number that I had one in my mind since January, and it's certainly beyond double what I thought it was. But I know that when we say numbers, however important they are, I feel like we might just miss out on the individual. We might miss out that person, when we lump them together with over 100 other individuals, we might forget that one person is a mother, that one person is a brother or a father or a Talmud or a student. That one person is a universe that has a whole group of people that miss that individual. So I don't want to share that number only because I don't want to lose sight of the power of that one person. It's not easy to stand here, not because I have stage fright, which I clearly do, but for other reasons, because I know people in this room. I know individuals. They're familiar to me because I've seen them. I've worked with some of them. I work with some of their parents. And I want to represent them in a way that's accurate. I want to tell their story in a way that we could understand and hopefully use that information to change as a community, because we need to. We're no longer in a position where we could sit back and relax and say everything is okay. We're losing our brothers and sisters. We're losing people, we're losing universes and worlds. And in order to change, you first need to state the facts, you need to state the truth, and then from there you move on. And you say, okay, where do we go? But we start with, where are we today? So I hope that I could represent the individuals, the families that are suffering with this problem in a way that all of us can learn from and ultimately grow from. Today we're in a crisis. In the past 10 years, for those who've been looking at the data, the rates of overdose in America have nearly doubled. Or shall I say they've nearly tripled. They've more than doubled. The rates of overdose when it comes to opioids, which are painkillers, has increased 300%, and when it comes to heroin, it's around 600%. So we're not dealing with, and these are big terms like heroin, but we're not dealing with every once in a while we hear a story. And it used to be, we did hear stories, but no one ever called it what it really was. People passed away, but it was a heart attack or something else. But today we're calling it, we're giving it a name, and we're saying people are struggling with drug addiction and with plenty other addictions, and we're losing lives as a result of it. Where did this come from? Just a very brief history. Around 20 years ago, there was a change in the perspective when it comes to dealing with the treatment of pain. And doctors changed their attitudes towards giving out opioids and started saying that if people are in pain, we need to treat them in any way possible. So instead of refraining or restraining from giving out medications to treat pain, they started giving them out by the dozen. They were writing scripts enough for every adult in this country to have access to a bottle of pills in their bathroom if they were struggling from anything, a toothache or whatever it might be. And that's what they continued to do for a while. And over time, it stopped working. The government realized, the doctors realized that these drugs were simply too addictive and too dangerous to have around people's homes. And before I go further, I just want to say, there are many homes that have pills just lying around. And most people just forget about them. But you should know the addicts do not forget about them. They know this fact really, really well. I have someone that I worked with recently told me he cleared out his uncle's home, his aunt's home, his Rebbe's home, because he knew that people are just not paying attention. They just have these bottles lying around. So if we can learn one thing, it's be careful. And it might not be your child at this age, and it might not be your child at another age, but it could be that they'll develop into that person later, or it could be that they have a friend that might just so happen to come to your house. So drugs were everywhere. These painkillers were everywhere until we caught up to the reality that they were hurting people. People were dying, they were getting hooked on them, they couldn't get off. The government got involved and they said, we have to make it harder for people to gain access to drugs, and they put a stop to it. They started tracking who was taking it so people couldn't doctor shop anymore. And that created an additional problem, which was, what do you do with the people who are already addicted? There were lots of people who were taking them for years, and they didn't know how to stop taking them. Aside from their body being addicted to it, emotionally they were addicted to it, spiritually they were addicted to it. So then they turned to the streets. And on the streets you have a very similar drug. For those who may not know, opioids and heroin work the same way as other painkillers. They work in a very similar fashion, and people turn to the streets, and that's why we started seeing this increase in overdose. So while numbers and the predicament may be important, today we're not talking about numbers, tonight we're talking about change. What can we do about this? And for one, we're stating the facts. We have a problem. And we have a very big problem, because people are doing these things and we can't call it what it is because there's a lot of shame connected to it. But today we're standing here, we're saying, and everyone in this room is creating a great deal of change. I'm going to be sharing a bunch of stories, and please know that I'm going to obviously change the information of those stories to protect the identity of the people I work with. But there's one story I want to share that is not about the people I work with, but it's about my friend. I have a friend who I grew up with, who several months ago passed away. And he passed away as a result of his addiction to drugs. I don't know which of you have been to a funeral that is related to drugs, but they tend to be very, very, very sad. Anytime you lose anybody, it's a tragedy. But often, when it's related to such a tragedy, there's so much shame involved that people don't even want to have a levaya in a proper fashion. Often it's held beside the grave, and where this one took place. We're standing there, a group of his close friends and family, and a few people that knew him growing up, and we cried and we spoke about his life. And there was a part of it that we started talking about him again. We stopped talking about his suffering and what he's been through and how we could help him. We started talking about the person. Some of us smiled to just remembering what he was like, who he was as an individual. But there were lots of questions. There were tears that were shed. But there was one question that was not asked. And I remember coming home and speaking to my wife about it and saying why. No one ever asked the question why and how. No one asked how did this happen or why did this happen to this man. And the reason I believe is because we all knew. Everyone there that night knew why and knew how, because we all grew up with him. We all saw him go through a family of divorce, which was very challenging and traumatic for him. We all saw him struggle academically. We saw him struggle with friends, making them, retaining them. We saw him struggle finding a shidduch. We saw him struggle in his marriage. We saw him struggle being a parent. So we saw his life of suffering. So no one asked why. We cried. And why really didn't matter at the time. But for tonight, it gives us some sense and maybe a clue into what addiction is. For those closest to an addict, those in this room who are either experienced addiction or who know someone who's experienced addiction, they don't ask why because they know, because they're so familiar with the suffering. So in order to understand who becomes an addict and ultimately how to treat them, let's work backwards. And this was addressed a little bit before, but let's ask the question of who enters into treatment. Who ultimately goes and gets help? Let's look at the data of that. And I want to point out 3 studies, the 3 studies that have really dominated the addiction field and have just shed some light onto who addicts are and who are the people who ultimately end up seeking help. Probably the most important study was what we call the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. It was a very simple study, but they studied it over and over again over a span of many, many years. And the results were always the same. They took a list of 10 adverse experiences. experiences that could create pain for anybody, going through a challenging experience, going through a divorce, struggling academically, having a parent who's an addict, and so on and so on. And they attributed to each of these adverse experiences a single point. And what they said is that if people have experienced X amount of points, they are much more likely to have an addiction later on in their life. Not only an addiction, but they're much more likely to suffer from a great many maladies in their life. So what we find is, when you look backwards, that 2/3 of people who are in treatment for addiction have a ACE score of 4 and above. 2/3. That's quite, to me, in my mind, that's an overwhelming majority of individuals, and it sheds some light. It tells us a story. And what it starts saying is, people who are in treatment for addiction are people who have had adverse experiences in their childhood. The second study are the studies related to PTSD and its comorbidity rates with addiction. If you look at virtually every study with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, virtually every study points to the fact that people who have had trauma in their life also experience addiction. They share similar pathologies and they share similar life experiences. The other one is a study put out by the Harvard Center of the Developing Child, which really looks to explore childhood experiences. And I'm going to quote from one of their studies that came out. It says this: early childhood stress leads to adaptations in behavior and comfort-seeking patterns. When we talk about adaptations in behavior and comfort-seeking patterns, what that means is that people who've experienced stress need to find another way to live in this world. They need to find another way to experience comfort. People, so to sum up these primary studies, people who become addicts are those who've experienced a great deal of pain. And I know this is a big statement to make, and I've worked with addicts for my entire career. I have never met an addict who has not lived a life filled with pain. Never. I've never met an addict who's had a comfortable experience. I've never met an addict who had a part of their life that they wouldn't willingly trade in for another. These are people who have suffered a great deal. When you look at the statistics on people who are in treatment centers nationally, you can't find a study that doesn't have a number lower than 60%, but most of them are between 60 and 80%, that speak about individuals in treatment for addiction have a history of trauma. I wanted to ask this question to my colleagues in the Jewish community. I had the opportunity to work in a program called The Living Room, which is a center for people in our brothers and sisters from all our communities who are in recovery from addiction. And I reached out to a friend of mine, Menachem Poznansky, who's the director. And I said, what are the percentages of the people in the program today that have a history of abuse or trauma? And he did not give me a number lower than 80%. And by the way, as the Rosh Hashiva mentioned before, the women, the girls who were in that program had higher rates than the men, but not a number lower than 80%. And I asked my brother, who runs our place as well. His numbers are very similar, and my wife, who works for Rabbi Wallerstein's school for girls at risk, numbers are the same. I have never, ever heard from anyone in this profession a number lower than 50%. So hopefully this begins to shed some light on who addicts are and where they come from and what is their lived experience. So if you take that and you try to pair it with addiction, what we find out is that the addiction to the addict is more about the solution than the problem. Now, I know that sounds very challenging, but let's try to make sense of it. One of the most common statements you will find in the recovery world when people are in treatment, when they're sharing their story with a group of other addicts to give each other strength and hope. One of the common things you will hear as they're recounting their childhood is, I always felt different and uncomfortable. My childhood was filled with discomfort until I had my first drug. And that made me feel normal. So as was recounted before, people having their first drink. For a regular person, it's an experience. I had a first drink, it was fun. Maybe I went overboard and got too drunk and got sick. But they forget about it, they move on. For the addict, getting drunk or getting high for the first time represents a form of comfort. It represents a relief from the life that they live, which is filled with pain. One of the first cases, actually, I was in Ohel when I had this case. I'm not sure if you'll remember, but at the time, it was a young man from our community who was homeless. And he came to Ohel because Ohel was the only organization that would treat him. My supervisor at the time said, we should charge this man to participate in treatment because he should have some form of ownership. And I said, how do we charge a homeless man to come to treatment? And he said, just $0.25. And I remember this man who was on the streets at the time when I started seeing him, he'd give just $0.25 when he came into therapy at that front desk on the 4th floor. And he entered into treatment, and he was raised in conditions I don't want to talk about tonight. They were horrific. Anyone in this room raised in such conditions, I can't imagine what what our lives would look like. I don't know how I would survive the way this man did. And he said something to me as I was first entering to this profession I'll never forget, so much so that I said to him, could you please repeat that? Because I want to write it down. I don't want to forget what you said. And I wrote it down, and I'll share with you today. He wrote about his first experience with drugs. He said, the first time I used heroin, I felt as though the world was hugging me. I felt comfortable for the first time in my life. When we think of heroin, we think of it as a drug that could kill us. And it does. That's the drug that does kill many people. But here was a person that experienced this drug and said, I finally felt hugged. I finally felt comfortable, like I could live, and the pain was relieved for just that moment. Gabor Mate, who's a leading expert in the field of addiction, made a statement in one of his books, and he said, it's impossible to understand addiction without first asking what relief the addict finds in the drug or the addictive behavior. We can't understand addiction until we understand its relieving quality. And you only experience relief if there's something that you need to experience relief from. For most of us, taking a drug or drinking, it's a way to escape. It's not a form of relief, or as if you could breathe for the first time. But if you've had a life of suffering and pain, you take a drug, it provides you with a sense of relief. So let's try to create a new definition of what addiction is. Addiction is many things, but at its core, addiction is a failed attempt at pain relief because it never works, as we'll see in a bit. It's an attempt to relieve yourself of pain, yet it never works, but at least initially it provides you with some form of relief. Now, most of us are given this for free. Most of us are given love and support and containment for free by our parents, by our teachers, by our rabbeim. They hold us, they hug us, they let us know that the world is safe and okay. Addicts do not. You notice if you go to the rooms, what we call the rooms of recovery, this 12-step programs, there's a lot of hugging that takes place. At the end of most meetings, people hold hands and recite the serenity prayer. When people meet each other after not seeing each other for a day or two, they're hugging one another. And I once asked an older man who I was working with, I said, why do you hug so much? And he said, I'm making up for lost time. I need to hug because that's what makes me feel okay. And I never had it. So I hug. And the other people in the room receive that and give it back as well. So what is addiction? How does it work? As was mentioned before, there's obviously a progression of use where you start, and it starts generally casual, and then slowly, especially for those who are very attracted to it, it becomes habitual fairly quickly. That is of the landmark of addiction. There are unsuccessful efforts to stop. Most addicts, by the time they make their way into an office for treatment, depends how old they are. Some of them have been suffering for 20+ years, trying to stop over and over and over again, every single morning. Imagine, we'll talk maybe a little later about a client of mine who literally every single week buys a new device to utilize his drug. And I asked him, why are you buying a new device every week? He said, because at the end of the week, I throw it out. And I said, I'm going to go into Shabbos without anything and no drug paraphernalia. I'm going to start over and I'm going to get clean. But then what happens again? Sunday, Monday hits. He's trying, he's struggling, he's trying to get better. And what he does, he finds himself back in that same place again. But imagine a world of 20+ or even 5+ years of unsuccessful efforts to stop something that is really harming you. increased problems in one's life, addiction creates problems. And these are the three main aspects of addiction: progression of use, unsuccessful efforts, and increased problems where it hurts. But those are just symptoms. The story of addiction is, I'm just going to read this. I had a client said to me a few weeks ago, and I've been working with him for nearly a year now, and he's been suffering for an addiction for 15 plus years. And he's not clean today. Today he's out there trying to get clean, and I'm not his first therapist trying to help him get clean. I'm probably his 10th. And he looked at me the other day, and he's shared his life with me a great deal, and he said, "I don't think you understand what it's like to wake up each morning hating yourself." I said, "You're right, I don't. I don't think I could really understand that. I believe you. I'm listening to you. I hear you. I don't think I could really understand what that means to wake up that way." And why does he feel that way? Because it's been 15 years of struggle. It's been 15 years of battle, and those 15 years of hiding, of lying, of being lonely, of struggling with relationships, and the relationships that he does have, it's a relationship where he only shares what he feels he can because he can't really be genuine. It's hard to be genuine when you feel broken. It's a lot easier to share yourself with another person when you feel whole. He's stagnant professionally, he's fragile, he has marriage problems, he has insecurity with raising his children, and he's lost spiritually. He's having a hard time finding himself and finding Hashem in this world. Addiction is a prison. Addiction destroys lives, destroys people, destroys families. It takes children away from their parents. It takes parents away from their children. It's a prison. And it doesn't work. We speak about how it's supposed to be something that relieves pain, but after a very short while, it stops working. It may start with experimentation, which leads to habitual use, but ultimately leads to a cycle. Once engaged in that cycle, you completely forget why you were there in the first place. And that's what everyone's been referring to when we say a person gets stuck, where their bechira gets lost, and we use terms like no free will, they're caught in a disease, they're lost, and they have no way out. I had my first exposure to real addiction when I first met with a guy who was smoking marijuana. And for those who know about marijuana, it's of the lower forms of drugs on the spectrum of drugs. There are drugs that are much more potent and much more harmful than marijuana. And that's not a suggestion to try it. But it's certainly not the worst. And I was working with this man who, at the time when I started seeing him, his marriage broke up because he couldn't stop. There was an ultimatum at a certain point. And as was mentioned before, sometimes you need to be really firm. There was an ultimatum. And he couldn't stop, so his marriage broke up. And then there was an ultimatum that he would lose his custody of his child. And he couldn't stop, and he lost custody of his child. And then there was an ultimatum that he would lose visitation rights, and he still couldn't stop. And I remember asking my supervisor, "It's just marijuana. What's going on?" And he said, "Kivi, you're missing the point of addiction. It doesn't matter what the drug is. The cycle is what's important. He's caught in a world where he doesn't know how to escape. He's trying to, but he just doesn't know a way out, and it doesn't matter what he's taking." Once you're engaged in this cycle, it becomes a self-perpetuating one where the pain that you have fuels the behavior and the addiction ultimately fuels the pain. I was working with a man once who's doing really well now, by the way. There was a point where he came into my office, and this was his first day. He said, "I haven't looked at myself in the mirror for 5 years because I was afraid of what I was going to see. And today I looked in the mirror. I built up the courage to look myself in the face and see what I was and what I'd become." And he said, "I didn't like what I saw, and that's why I came into your office today." But what he was sharing with me was that he forgot. He said, "I was angry. I remember I used to be angry. I was angry at the world. I was angry at Yiddishkeit. I was angry at my parents." And he goes, "When I looked myself in the mirror after 5 years, I forgot what I was angry about. At that point, I was just lost." But now this man has received treatment. He's okay. He's married. He has a beautiful marriage. He has children. He lives amongst us. He's doing really well, which leads us really to treatment. We can't go into the minutia tonight. I know I'm running out of time. We can't talk about the specifics of treatment, but I think it's important to talk about what treatment is concerned about. What addiction treatment would ultimately like to accomplish with the people that enter into it. Number one, it's about stopping the behavior. There's no way that you're ever going to get to a place where you could uncover any form of pain so long as you're using drugs and so long as you're engaged in any form of addictive behavior. I had a client who used to come into my office and say, after every meeting we have, I want to go out and use drugs because it's too painful to tolerate it. And my answer to him was, well, that's you, that's your life. Your life, sometimes there's pain in your life, but at least you're not running from it, you're living in it. And we'll help you find a way to survive through that pain. We'll get through it a step at a time. Don't have to be so afraid of that pain, but you need to know that for addiction to work, the addictive behavior needs to stop. Ultimately, you get to exploring the pain and finding alternate ways to live in this world. We try to find additional people, new people to surround ourselves with, new places to visit, and try to distance ourselves from the things that ultimately harm us. But ultimately, you want to live a life that's acceptable to you. You want to live a life that you could feel okay waking up in the morning and breathing and comfortable with the decisions that you make and the choices that you choose to live with. One of the things that I've become familiar with hearing, but never really, but always surprises me, but at this point I'm not so surprised because I hear it all the time. People in recovery often make the statement, I'm grateful for my addiction. And you'd think, how could you be grateful for your addiction? It caused so much suffering to you, to everyone else in your life, to your marriage, to your children, to your family, to your parents. How could you be grateful for your addiction? And the answer is always the same, because ultimately my addiction brought me to recovery. And recovery taught me how to live. It taught me how to tolerate myself, how to tolerate my life, how to feel okay in my own skin. Now, that's not a suggestion for anyone here to become an addict. But for those people who have been through it, they're learning how to live. And you can't imagine what that's like to see an adult, to see someone who's lived a long time, rediscover life in a way that is satisfactory and comfortable. And people get better. I asked my brother Wansani, who runs Our Place, I said, could you give me a characteristic that you see of the people, the adolescents that you work with? Who are the ones that make it, and who are the ones that don't? And his answer has always been consistent, and I've seen this throughout, and I've also, the other professionals I've spoken to have seen it the same way, that the individuals who have support, who have family, who have love, as was mentioned before, who have that unconditional feeling from the people around them, are those that are most likely to make it. You have programs like the Living Room, you have programs like OL and Amudim, and all the other organizations connected today were like Relief. And I'd ask the people in this room, I know because I'm familiar with a bunch of you, I'm asking all the addicts and all the families with addicts to look around tonight, look at the people in our community who have chosen to be here, to say that we could accept this, we could deal with it, we could take a step at a time, and we could get better. Just know that there's a way out. And I know that addiction is the darkest place that a person could live in. You live in a crevice, you live in a cave. But look around and say, here's a group of people that are willing to allow me to come out and allow me to express some of that suffering and pain and allow me to exist. There are programs out there that could help you. Every program could help you in a different capacity, and you have a whole different sort of them. Come out of the darkness, and all I could say, it's going to be hard. The journey is a very painful one, and it's a slow one, and there are many setbacks. But I could promise you a life that is a lot more comfortable and it's filled with a lot more light than the one you're living in today. I want to just review, the study was mentioned before, Rat Park. Dr. Bruce Alexander challenged one of the basic notions that we had about addiction. Addiction in the 60s, where all the studies were done on the physiological effects of drugs on the brain. They basically took rats, stuck them in a cage, and were able to prove that those rats would take the drug to the point where it would kill them. Bruce Alexander and his team decided to create a park. rat park. And in that park, what he was able to show is that rats, and we're supposed to learn the lesson for people as well, who are in a community where there's love and there's connection and there's what to lose if you become an addict. People are much less likely to become addicts in the first place, but I think even more so, for people who are in a community, they're much more likely to get help. The more we become a community that's willing to accept that this problem exists and look it in the face and tolerate it, the more the people who are suffering could come forward. We need to learn from Rat Park. So my final words for tonight. Tonight we acknowledge in a very open forum, in a beautiful forum, that we have a problem. Our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, our fathers, our children, our students are dying. Some of them are dying physically, but for those who are not dying physically, there's a whole many more who are dying spiritually, emotionally. They're suffering. And today we acknowledge that. We also acknowledge that we need to help them. And we have places that do help. The organizations that we're dealing with that are here tonight have collected millions of dollars to help people who are suffering with these issues, and they're here to help. And they need more, by the way. They need more money because there's always a greater need. Know that there are people to help, sorry? Huh? Yes. Know that there are people that are here to help. And I just want to give us all a bracha, that Hashem should guide us through these challenging times, and we may see the end of all the suffering in our time as quickly as possible. Tonight we have a special guest who was not on the list, but I am so honored to introduce. I don't know this man personally, at least I don't believe I do. But I feel like I know him because I know the people who suffer like this, I feel so honored that they've shared their lives with me. And I've journeyed along with them through the process of recovery. He's a man who has enough courage to stand here tonight and share his story with us. I'd please like to introduce Ike.